Let's make it epic.
Yakuza has a bit of a mixed history with its American audience. Sega localized the first several games in the series, minus spin-offs Kenzan and Kurohyo. However, when they did decide to bring us a spin-off, for some reason they decided on Dead Souls, the non-canon alternate reality game where a zombie apocalypse breaks out in Kamurocho, causing the four main characters to put down their fists and pick up guns instead. Much to no one's surprise, except for Sega's, it sold pretty poorly, and in an exquisite show of total tone deafness, they took this as a sign that the West wasn't interested in Yakuza in general, and decided to stop localizing the series over here. This proved to be an aggravating move, because Western Yakuza fans still wanted the main series to be brought over, and thus, tons of campaigning from passionate diehards was required to get Sega to change their minds. Eventually, they finally did. Yakuza 5 was successfully brought over in 2015, 3 years after its launch in Japan, and it was digital only, no doubt as a safety precaution in case its sales were middling, so they wouldn't take as big of a financial hit as they would if they committed to printing physical copies. But that worry ended up being unnecessary, and Yakuza 5 ended up being a hit. Many considered it to be the last great PlayStation 3 exclusive, 2 years into the PlayStation 4's tenure. With the game's success, Sega would go on to localize almost every Yakuza game thereafter with little worry, and the series only kept growing from there, especially after Yakuza 0, which breathed so much new life into the franchise's popularity, it's likely the most common first game for many fans you see today. And for good reason. It offered a compelling story, colorful and charismatic characters, hilarious and charming side missions, a metric ton of side content, and most importantly, as a series prequel that didn't expect you to have knowledge of prior games, it was also a great place to start. After that, the West received Yakuza Kiwami, a remake of the first game, Yakuza 6, the final entry in Kiryu's story, Kiwami 2, a remake of the second game, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, an adaptation of the popular shonen manga made by Ryuga Gotoku Studio using the same engine as Yakuza 0, and with combat that feels very familiar. And there was Judgment, a crime-solving spin-off set in Kamurocho and starring the A-list Japanese celebrity Takuya Kimura. And this brings us all to right now, the Western release of Yakuza Like a Dragon, also known as Yakuza 7. After the end of the decade-long journey of Kiryu Kazuma, the series decided to go in a different direction, offering us not only an entirely new cast of characters, but an unexpected genre switch as well, to turn-based RPG. It was actually shown off as an April Fool's joke back in 2019 because it seemed too ridiculous, but imagine everyone's surprise when it turned out to be legit. Needless to say, it was a divisive change. Most people were either indifferent or curious, while some were very excited, including those who love turn-based games and haven't experienced Yakuza just yet. Others were outright furious, claiming they'd never touch the game because of their active distaste for such gameplay. So, now that the game is out, was this change worth it? Did it bolster, ruin, or ultimately change nothing about the Yakuza experience? Now that I've played the game, let's talk about it. Yakuza Like a Dragon puts you into the shoes of Ichiban Kasuga, a low-ranking Tojo clan soldier of the low-ranking Arakawa family. The game starts off on December 31st, 2000, with Ichiban in the middle of doing menial tasks to earn his family some much-needed cash. Sadly, things go awry on what should have been a pleasant New Year's Eve, and our airheaded but fiercely loyal main character willingly accepts a horrific plea from the patriarch he has the utmost respect for, taking the fall for the murder of a rival family member in place of the actual assailant. Thus, Ichiban is sent to prison and serves a total of 18 years for a crime he didn't commit. After his release, he realizes things have changed. A lot. He discovers that not only did the Omi Alliance perform a successful takeover of Kamurocho, but apparently it was his own boss and father figure, Masumi Arakawa, who betrayed the Tojo and helped make it happen. Ichiban attempts to confront him, but is shot and dumped into a pile of trash in Yokohama, south of Tokyo, where he discovers a counterfeit bill that was placed in his possession after being wounded, and this is more or less where the journey truly begins. Ichiban sets out to discover the bill's origins while simultaneously trying to solve the city's problems and looking for a way to discover the truth about the events he missed while in prison, all with the help of a cast of new characters to support him. As you can likely tell if you played past games before, this story has a lot of parallels with the beginning of Kiryu's, who also served a prison sentence for a murder he didn't commit, and the first game in the series was also about his return to a very different world. Yakuza 1 and 7 also share the theme of chasing money to discover a deeper plot, but with differing implementations. While Kiryu's first outing had him following a trail for a missing 10 billion yen, Ichiban's game has him looking for the meaning behind 10,000 yen he has on him. This is a recurring thing throughout the entire game. Ichiban comes across circumstances and events that are identical in theme to the first Yakuza game, but with a nearly opposite execution. Not only does reusing the plot and backstory in such a way establish both a sense of familiarity and newness with our debuting protagonist, but it conveniently allows Ichiban to be behind bars for the entirety of Kiryu's saga, minus the events of Zero, of course. Thus, it has little to no meaningful overlap with Ichiban's, as the two are completely detached from one another. It should come as no surprise, but following up Kiryu's entire decade-long 7-game arc with a new main character is a tough job, and requires no slouching in the storytelling department. With this in mind, the first couple hours of the game are extremely cutscene heavy, as you could probably parse from my story summary a minute or so ago, which was all set up taking place across the first 3 chapters of the game. And I'm talking about a borderline Metal Gear Solid 4 level of cutscene to gameplay ratio. Thankfully, it's very gripping and does more than an adequate job of setting up our main character and the foundation of the narrative. There's a lot to like about Ichiban. He's a very endearing and charismatic guy, but also completely setting himself apart from Kiryu, both personality-wise and in the nuances of his backstory. He's a wisecracking, stubborn dolt who is obsessed with Dragon Quest and dreams of becoming a hero. He dislikes taking advantage of people who are already down on their luck, but has no issue in actively mocking and pissing off people who are needlessly malicious or selfish. He's extremely capable in a fight from the get-go and is definitely no pushover. Much like Kiryu, he's also an orphan raised by adoptive parents, but the key difference in this case is Ichiban was born to a mother who abandoned him in a soapland, which led to him being raised by the establishment's owner, as well as the other working girls. He's a man raised by his community, in the truest sense of the idea. What he lacks in book smarts, he makes up for in sheer passion and sympathy for his fellow man. In summation, he's a fantastic main character with quirks and a bright personality, and he blends in very well with the goofier aspects of his world, as opposed to contrasting them in humorous ways like the significantly more serious and stone-faced Kiryu. In addition to Ichiban, there are a few more key players, as you would expect from a type of game where combat utilizes a team. There's Adachi, a gruff detective who loves a good drink, Nanba, a nurse-turned-hobo who likes to play things safe, and Saiko, a barmaid who isn't afraid to speak her mind. Together with Ichiban, they make a very unlikely ragtag group of protagonists. However, the most important part is chemistry, especially when they're all integral to the plot and constantly talk to one another both in cutscenes and randomly out in the world. And they bounce off of each other very well, whether they're offering unsolicited musings when you're running around or having a heart-to-heart conversation at the bar. Ichiban and his 3 partners in crime have very investing relationships with one another, each with their own personalities that shine when it matters. And the enthralling characters don't just stop at the people who join your party. Ichiban's former boss, Masumi Arakawa, is a hell of an interesting guy himself. You learn a lot about him throughout the first couple hours of the game, and he could have easily been a Yakuza protagonist back in the 70s. Then you have the city of Yokohama, specifically Isezaki Ijincho. If you've played Yakuza games before, then you know that its locations are practically characters in themselves, usually inspired by real-life Japanese locations and districts, all the way down to specific popular landmarks and buildings, which are recreated with perfect or near-perfect accuracy. Kamurocho was the central hub of the franchise pretty much since day one, occasionally sharing the spotlight with Sotenbori. There are other cities throughout the series, usually limited to one appearance. While both Kamurocho and Sotenbori do make a return here, they both take a back seat to the much larger Yokohama. And when I say much larger, I mean much larger. If I had to give an estimate, I'd say it's about 3 times the land area of Kamurocho. At the very least, it's bigger than Kamurocho and Sotenbori combined. It is, without question, the biggest location the series has had. Furthermore, all taxi stop locations aren't unlocked and available from the get-go like usual. They're discovered as you wander around. So not only will you be on foot more often due to sheer map size, you'll be on foot because it's your only mode of transportation for a large chunk of the game, unless you rush them down as soon as possible. A bit inconvenient, yes, but alleviated by the fact that you can be picked up from anywhere using your phone, for a slightly more expensive fee. You might think this larger world would sacrifice the density of content and things to do that previous games boasted, because despite how much smaller they were in comparison, they were stuffed to the brim with other activities to waste time on. Now, thankfully, Yokohama is no different. There's no risk of content being spread thin over the significantly larger area. There's still a ton of shops and buildings to enter, restaurants to eat from, and most importantly, minigames to enjoy. A lot of staple minigames make a return, such as shogi, karaoke, golf, the batting center, and darts, plus gambling games like mahjong, pachislot, poker, blackjack, oichokabu, and koi-koi. Arcades are back again too, as they always are, featuring older, real-life arcade Sega titles to play, specifically Outrun, Fantasy Zone, Super Hang-On, Space Harrier, Virtua Fighter 2 and 2.1, and Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown, with the last 3 including a 2-player versus mode so you can play actual sets with people sitting right next to you. Simultaneously amusing and depressing as it may sound, Judgment, Kiwami 2, and this game are the only ways to play Virtua Fighter 5 on current-day platforms. You'd think Sega would at least do us the courtesy of including a practice mode, but sadly that's not the case. It's either arcade mode in single-player, or 2-player versus from the main menu. For Virtua Fighter fans, it's better than nothing, I suppose. But the real main course of every Yakuza minigame collection is the original stuff. The minigames that are basically fully fledged systems that often include their own contained narrative and immense rewards. This is one of the spots where the franchise has truly shown its brightest in the past, by featuring these insanely creative and enthralling detours from the main plot that could keep you busy for an entire sitting. Some of the best minigames in the series could steal your attention for hours upon hours of playtime, to the point where you might forget where you are in the story by the time you get back to it. Like a Dragon not only continues this legacy, but probably does it the best, depending on who you ask. First is Can Collection, which is a combined vehicular combat and collectible gathering game. You ride a cart through the streets of southern Yokohama and pick up cans to return to your starting point. The catch is that other NPCs are trying to do the same, and will try to attack you in order to take what you have. There's a boost power-up that lets you attack these enemies back, and a garbage truck obstacle that will take every single can from you if you crash into it. The more cans you collect, the more points you score, and you spend those points on items. Simple, straightforward, and doesn't take very long to master due to having only 3 difficulties. Then there's the Movie Theater, a reaction-based whack-a-mole minigame that has Ichiban trying to fight his urge to sleep while watching a film. Sheep will pop up around him and you have to use the face buttons and directional buttons to hit them and make them go away before they do damage to you. Occasionally a chicken will show up who will actually help Ichiban stay awake, but if you attack it on accident, it hurts. Like can collecting, it's simple and straightforward, but has many more stages and allows you to invite party members to accompany you for some extra interactions. Next is the Vocational School, which is an uncomplicated series of 5-question trivia quizzes. Getting 3 correct means you pass, and Ichiban gets a boost to his personality traits, which are stats that affect various interactions with NPCs. There's a service called PartTimeHero.com that Ichiban participates in, but it's not a true minigame in the sense that it offers an interactive distraction that deviates from the normal gameplay loop. It's really just a long list of side missions ranging from one-time fights to specific enemy hunts to item fetch quests. It's a good way to get items, equipment, and money early on, but otherwise it's nothing terribly special. The 2 minigames that shine the most in Like a Dragon, however, are Business Management and Dragon Kart. These are the 2 that have an actual subplot tied to them. Business Management is exactly how it sounds. You purchase properties and hire employees, Then, keeping their stats in mind, you put them in the right position that earns more profit. When you're done with preparation, you begin the sales period, and watch to see if you make money or dip into the red. It's a process that's vaguely similar to the real estate minigame in Yakuza 0, and somewhat suffers from the same amount of tedium on the organization side. If you hit your stride and know what you're doing, then you likely won't even feel driven to take further risks, because honestly there's no real reason to. But the biggest difference now is shareholder meetings. These are actual honest-to-God verbal fights, where Ichiban meets with angry investors and, with chosen employees at his side, argues with them to convince them to stick around and continue throwing money at his business. This is where business management really shines, as it's a very fast-paced minigame that keeps you on your toes and constantly pressing buttons, because if you stall, the punishment could be severe, especially since a failed shareholder meeting will knock you down the corporate ladder and make you lose money. It's quite a time sink and will take about 4 hours to complete, depending on how serious you take it, but the rewards are huge, because as you might expect, this is the minigame you abuse to get millions of yen. Finally, there's Dragon Kart, possibly the most ambitious minigame thrown into the franchise to date. Yakuza is no stranger to racing minigames, considering the Pocket Circuit in Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 1, and drone racing in Judgment. However, this time around it's a life-sized kart racing game that involves human drivers, and it plays exactly how it looks, like an old-fashioned, family-friendly kart game. There's boosts, there's hops, there's drifting, there's weapons, there's coins. Every staple kart racer trope is accounted for. As a minigame, it's a competently made distraction, but I can't imagine it being terribly investing to people who are already kind of ambivalent to kart racers. The weapons feel alright, and the sense of speed isn't all that great if you're not boosting, and customization is borderline non-existent, at least for cosmetics. Pocket Circuit gave you significantly more options than Dragon Kart does. It doesn't ask for as much of a time investment as business management does, and you'll probably complete its subplot in about 2 hours' time. Like a Dragon's collection of original minigames is vast, and probably the highest point it's been in the entire series. Unfortunately, visiting hostess clubs is no longer a side game in itself that requires investment like in past games, where you would sit down and actually hold conversations with the girl and choose right or wrong dialogue choices. Here they simply act as places to eat and increase your bond level with male party members. Personally, I think it would have been totally perfect if the club management minigame from Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 2 returned as well, because it's fucking amazing and my favorite minigame of all time. But I can understand the developers wanting to do something new in this regard. This game maintains the long-standing tradition of giving the players stuff to do when they're not doing the story, and you'll be spoiled for choice, no question. Having so many distractions helps the world feel alive and interactive, and sidesteps the constant weakness we see in many open-world games of maps being large but having nothing to offer except chores and busy work. This has arguably been the franchise's greatest strength, and it continues here with flying colors. And all of this is on top of the firmly held reputation of humorous, fun sub-stories that every game has, another area that these titles excel at. For those who are already fans of the series, you already know what I mean, but for the sake of those looking to begin their Yakuza experience with Like a Dragon, I'll give a brief explanation. Substories are the franchise's side quests, and they vary in length and complexity, but often maintain a very lighthearted or outright goofy and ridiculous sense of humor, usually in contrast to the more serious main story. Every game in the series has several dozen substories to spend time on, introducing new characters or gameplay features and offering nice rewards. And many end up gaining a life of their own among the Yakuza community for being particularly absurd. Like a Dragon maintains this tradition with ease, giving the player a smorgasbord of sub-stories to participate in, and they're just as silly as ever. Examples include, but aren't limited to, getting a homeless man a date with a soup kitchen volunteer, fighting a giant truck-sized Roomba, capturing a public urinator, fighting a group of men in diapers after interrupting their baby roleplay service, escorting a naked man down the street to a clothing store while avoiding water-based obstacles that could wash away the bath bubbles covering his delicate areas, and fighting an excavator being driven by a chimpanzee. No, I am not joking about any of these, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. I won't go into detail any further, as these things deserve to be experienced on their own, but rest assured, they're just as great as they always have been throughout the entire series. And not only are they immensely entertaining in themselves, but they tend to give worthwhile items and gear. Visually, the game is very good looking, even on the base PS4 I played on. The Dragon engine, as demanding as it is, proves once again that it can offer an experience that can handle a fair amount of NPCs on screen alongside many environmental assets and a decently far draw distance. Even during minigames like Dragon Kart, which can get fairly busy with visual effects, I hardly experienced any slowdowns or frame rate drops. The game never crashed once. Character models look great in both gameplay and real-time cutscenes, and combat is bolstered by a ton of awesome, vibrant particle effects and seamless transitions to battle cutscenes, like special essence moves or summons. The strength of the engine helps provide a consistent, snappy game that isn't slowed by any type of needless downtime. Then there's the music. Yakuza games have always had some catchy tunes, both in karaoke and in the background for fights, and Like a Dragon is no different. A necessity for any turn-based RPG is having a good battle theme, and the one here is awesome, a track worth downloading and bumping from your speakers whenever you want. But the cuts don't stop there. Boss themes are rock-solid tracks too. The entire original soundtrack in general has a wide variety of electronic songs crossing over many levels of heaviness, pace, and atmosphere. They get the blood pumping and push you through the fight. Finally, it's time to discuss the elephant in the room, the drastic, somewhat divisive genre switch to turn-based RPG. It should come as no surprise that many people are used to and fond of the old-fashioned beat-em-up combat the series has had since day one. It was a system that was functional, generally speaking, though didn't go much beyond that, if I'm being honest. If I had to say which Yakuza games before this had actual great combat, I would name only 5 and 0. Other than those, combat throughout the series usually hovered around serviceable. However, if there's one thing they always did right, it was allowing you to be an absolute badass by providing opportunities to overpower random mooks or even bosses and perform insanely painful looking heat moves on them that would kill a normal person. It made Kiryu look powerful and by extension made players feel powerful. The loss of this sensation was one of the most common complaints by people who initially disliked the idea of the genre switch, and I can understand why. However, if you expect me to say Yakuza always had perfect combat that didn't need to be changed, I would have to disagree, save for only a couple of games. Another big worry, even among people who like turn-based RPGs, is the level of commitment to the genre switch that the game would have. To be blunt, there was a fear that the developers would half-ass it, and it would ultimately end up feeling like a game made by people who knew little about how to make a good turn-based experience. In such a case, a lot could go wrong. It could be boring, tedious, and allow for little variety in builds or strategy, and also lack quality of life features and so on. Thankfully, this game does not trip into those pitfalls. Like a Dragon is not half-assed at all. In fact, I feel more passion and sincere interest in this turn-based system than I ever did with the beat-em-up combat of previous games. An immeasurable amount of love and care was put into this game to ensure it was enthralling, snappy, and fun, while also being a huge tribute to Dragon Quest. It barely sacrifices any of that visceral power you felt when playing as Kiryu in the past games, thanks to vibrant particle effects and heavy, impactful sound. Frankly, I have more fun with the combat here than I did in most other Yakuza games. It's obvious the developers knew exactly what makes Japanese turn-based RPGs tick, their strengths and weaknesses, and this knowledge comes through pretty much immediately. Once you start up the game and partake in a few battles, it becomes clear that this isn't just your standard stand still and trade blows affair that anti-turn-based people fear and hate. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that the encounters with random mobs here move along faster than they ever did before. When you enter a fight, your team and your enemies move around randomly in the arena, which is often outdoors with no hard boundaries. This isn't just for show. Where your party members and opponents are standing is actually kind of important. When you do a normal attack, you run over to your target, and if an item you can grab and use as a weapon is in the way, the character will use it for that turn, bolstering their offense one time. If it can't be picked up, such as furniture, then your party member or teammate will kick it toward their target deliberately for an extra few points of damage before carrying on with their attack. This isn't always consistent because they still need to adhere to physics, which may work in your favor as items may break on each other before they reach their target. Furthermore, positioning is necessary to hit as many enemies at once with area of effect attacks, or avoid it if you're on the receiving end. And as if addressing a long-standing visual quirk of this type of gameplay directly, if the aforementioned physics work in a manner that causes a person's attack to physically miss, as in the animation doesn't touch the target, it actually does count as a miss. Basically, letting your party members and foes wander around can be a fairly crucial point of strategy sometimes. Unfortunately, there's no way to actually move your party members yourself. You pretty much have to cross your fingers and hope they end up somewhere favorable. This lack of control isn't a huge issue and will very, very rarely matter much in the long run, but once in a blue moon you could find yourself in a compromising position because somehow your team allowed themselves to be cornered. However, it's usually a salvageable situation, and if it's your enemy that's cornered, the fight may be a bit easier. Like damn near every JRPG, there's also summons, but they're not conjured out of a magical circle in the ground or portal floating overhead. In Like a Dragon, summons are called by using Ichiban's smartphone, specifically an app called Poundmates. Instead of spending MP like one would assume, you actually spend money to summon help from various NPCs you meet through your journey. You can't spam the same summon over and over because they do have cooldowns, and they also have specific summon conditions, such as some only being available during the day or night. While your Poundmates usually deal damage, there are also some that debuff enemies or heal your party's HP or MP. The game doesn't expect you to use them constantly, so you can never touch this mechanic at all if you so desire, but they can be helpful to get out of a pinch. Then there's a little mechanic called Perfect Guards, which is an action any of your party members can pull off by simply pressing the guard button before an enemy hit lands. A few past RPGs have had a feature like this, such as Super Mario RPG. You can do this even if that character hasn't committed to guarding for a turn, and you can do it to pretty much any attack you can take. It does mitigate damage, but it depends on the attack. Sometimes it'll take off only a few points, sometimes it'll cut the damage in half. But the real reason to do it is to prevent status effects. It's not easy to pull off. The timing for a perfect guard can be insanely strict depending on the attack you're guarding against. Even if the animation is extremely telegraphed, you can never be terribly sure when the window will be during it. Sometimes it's earlier than you may expect, and trying to press the button at the actual last instant doesn't work. A poorly balanced RPG would make perfect guards crucial for survival and completely necessary to perform if you want your party members to take more than 2 hits. Cases like that usually turn the combat exhausting. Thankfully, Like a Dragon doesn't do that. As useful as perfect guards can be, you can get along just fine without depending on them. You should still definitely try to do them, because they can get you out of a sticky situation, as it did for me in a few fights where I survived attacks that would otherwise kill me. But even if you don't do them, you won't have to worry about being one-shotted by trash mobs or anything. This leads me to the topic of difficulty. One thing that people who are inexperienced with turn-based RPGs may worry about by sticking with the series is challenge. For someone who is pretty apathetic to the genre switch, or perhaps leans toward being soured by it, they may be further dissuaded from the game if it's hard. And frankly, it isn't. A tiny bit of common sense will get you very far in this game. I didn't lose a single fight until almost 30 hours in, and I basically just treated most encounters as DPS races up until that point, and got by simply nuking enemies with my strongest abilities immediately. While this may come as a relief to those who aren't terribly into turn-based games, it might also be a tiny bit disappointing to those who really hoped the game would lean into necessary strategy. But that's not to say that strategy doesn't exist here. Enemies have strengths and weaknesses, and in the case of tougher ones, movesets that you should remember, because while the average fight may be over in a flash, there are some tough spots you could find yourself in if you're too complacent, especially as you near the end of the game and bosses become downright oppressive. Even outside the actual combat, Yakuza fully commits to its new genre. Admittedly, it wouldn't be hard to do because if you played past games, then you already know that Yakuza features many RPG elements in them already, and would have required only minute tweaking to transform them into pure role-playing mechanics. It was already possible to equip gear to increase stats before, but now it's more in-depth, with character stats finally going beyond just health, heat, defense, and attack power. There are multiple types of damage resistances and even so-called magic that utilizes elements such as ice, fire, and electricity. There's also status effects that can debilitate either your party or your enemies, including but not limited to poison, paralysis, shock, charm, burn, and silence. If you've played any type of turn-based RPG before, these are already familiar to you, and they still work the same way in Like a Dragon as they do in any other RPG. And of course, there's the highly publicized job system, which allows you to change a party member's class to suit a specific role. This is just further evidence that the developers know how an RPG works, because every job has its ups and downs, and they often fall into traditional role-playing job types, such as tanks, healers, DPS, and mages. A couple jobs focus on big, raw damage. A couple jobs focus on elemental damage. A couple jobs focus on healing and buffing. And a couple jobs focus on tanking hits and crowd control. There's a specialized role for pretty much any type of RPG class you can think of, and it's crazy to realize that it's a Yakuza game that's doing this. You're not obligated to stick a character to one job for the entire game. Once you unlock the ability to switch between them fairly early on, you can do it to your heart's content. And yes, you can have multiple characters with the same job. There's a lot of freedom in team composition, more so than some Japanese RPG franchises have offered across multiple games. There's also more RPG mechanics given specifically to Ichiban, in the form of personality traits, which most people will probably associate with Persona's social attribute system. Here there are 6 categories to Ichiban's personality: passion, confidence, charisma, kindness, intellect, and style. As you play the game and participate in bonding moments with your party members, and especially as you do the vocational school quizzes, these stats will go up and allow you to access special interactions with specific NPCs, including romance options. This is a nice touch that further adds to the genre switch, and gives us better and more direct involvement with Ichiban's growth as a character. However, this system also feels a tad bit underutilized. It pretty much never comes into play regarding the main story, and when it's used for side content, it's limited to hiring people out on the street for the business management minigame, accessing a couple of areas, and wooing a few romanceable NPCs. While the process of increasing these traits can be fun and engaging, the things that you can access thanks to their higher levels leaves a lot to be desired, because that's when you realize they're just very surface level gates to relatively unremarkable content. It would have been really cool to see the personality system utilized as main story dialogue choices that altered the outcome of specific scenes, so payoff of leveling them up is more substantial. This would have really helped in driving home the RPG genre switch, and is one of the very few, if not the only, aspect of this game that I feel misses the mark a bit. As an added bonus, there's enemies. The Yakuza series always had a decent variety of foes to engage out on the streets as you play, plus a good amount of unique bosses that offer different levels of complexity and challenge. However, Like a Dragon goes above and beyond to give a veritable bestiary of over 200 different types of foes you'll encounter throughout the game. Yes, you heard right, over 200. A true RPG-like number of enemies. And what's better is that the game even gives you an in-game cyclopedia of their information after you fight them, and this content is delivered to you in the style of a Pokemon parody. Sadly, you can't capture any of them, but it's yet another aspect of the game that shows how much unwavering commitment the development team has for the RPG Switch. To close things off, I also want to touch a bit on the English dub. Starting with last year's Judgment, Ryuga Gotoku Studio has decided to bring English voice acting back to the franchise. It had been absent until that point since Yakuza 1, and it was a very unpopular inclusion, even in spite of some high-profile voice talent, like Mark Hamill. In Like a Dragon, however, the dub is significantly better received by fans, and for good reason. It's pretty damn solid. Characters sound how you may expect them to, and they only sound cartoony when their personality matches. and they didn't skimp out on the big names here either. In addition to experienced English voice actors such as Kaiji Tang, Brian Bloom, Elizabeth Maxwell, Robbie Daymond, and John Eric Bentley, we also got some Hollywood names like Will Yun Lee and George Takei. As an added bonus, Daryl Carrillo reprises his role as Kiryu after voicing him way back in the notorious Yakuza 1 dub, but his performance is significantly improved now. It's an all-around good dub. I don't know if I would tell longtime Yakuza fans to turn it on for their first playthrough, especially if they're used to Japanese voices of certain characters, but it's worth giving a shot. It's also worth mentioning that the subtitles for the Japanese and English dubs are both different. The subtitles for the Japanese voices are a more literal translation, while subtitles for the English dub are exactly what you hear, which are slightly readjusted lines to sound more Western, so to speak. Usually games skip doing the former and only do the latter, which means the dialogue doesn't match the Japanese lines actually being spoken, as they're meant to only match the English, and this often leads to complaints, because, worst case scenario, the subtitles may almost be the opposite of what the spoken dialogue is actually saying. However, the localization team went above and beyond to give us two different scripts. Overall, Yakuza Like a Dragon is just a hell of a good game. It has an investing story, a fantastic new protagonist, and a big new city. It has nice graphics and vibrant combat, a killer soundtrack, and a good English dub. It blends its new genre with the same spirit, story, character, and sense of humor that old fans have always loved, and without sacrificing anything consequential to pull it off. If anything, only good things were added to the experience. Just because it's turn-based now doesn't mean it's slow, tedious, and clunky. It's arguably faster than ever. And like usual, this game is packed with content and countless reasons and incentives to do them, including the premium adventure post-game that comes with every Yakuza game, and a New Game Plus mode that increases enemy levels and rewards, so the game doesn't necessarily have to stop once the credits are done. It's also just a fantastic love letter to its RPG peers. There's a bit of Final Fantasy, a bit of Pokemon, a bit of Persona, and a ton of Dragon Quest. It's extremely obvious that this game was made with utmost love, care, and respect to other turn-based JRPGs. It's remarkably daring for any long-running series to attempt a genre switch 8 games in, excluding spin-offs, but Like a Dragon pulls it off with flying colors. Anyone who decided to skip this game just because it's a full-blown RPG now is seriously missing out, because not only is this one of the most successful genre switches of all time, it's also one of the best Yakuza games. In fact, if I were to think on it enough, I could probably be swayed to say it's the best, period. It's a serious contender for my personal game of the year, and one of my favorites of this ending generation. It's that good. This concludes my review for Yakuza Like a Dragon. I love the new direction this series is taking, and saying I'm excited for more would be an understatement. I am deeply anticipating the next chapter in Ichiban's journey, and I have no doubt in my mind that Ryuga Gotoku Studio will meet my expectations. They've been doing it for a while now, sometimes twice a year. It's amazing how consistent they are. If you haven't touched a Yakuza game before, I implore you to try it now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
血がたぎるってもんじゃねえか